Long ago in the shadowed hills of northern Arvenmoor, there was a war that seemed destined never to end. Two kingdoms, locked in stubborn conflict for over 20 years, neither side gaining true victory nor willing to surrender. It was a land soaked in loss, where sons were buried before their fathers and crops went untended as soldiers marched endlessly back and forth. The people grew tired, the kings grew bitter, and the land itself felt like it was groaning beneath the weight of so much grief. But then one cold autumn night, under a pale and flickering moon, everything changed. It began near the ruins of an old monastery, a place where no soldier willingly camped, where even the most fearless knights would shiver near their fires, whispering prayers into their gauntlets. It was said that long ago the monks there had all perished in a fire, and that their spirits never left. Some believed it was nonsense, others swore by it, but the soldiers from the Western Kingdom had little choice. They were pushed back from the valley, and this ruined place was all that remained for shelter. That night strange things began to happen. First, the dogs refused to stay inside the camp. They whimpered and scratched at the dirt, trying to escape. Then came the bitter chill, not of the weather, but something else. A cold fat sank into the bones and refused to leave. And then as midnight came, a sound rose up from the earth, a low moan, as if the stones themselves were crying. Soon the campfires sputtered as if gasping for breath. The men tried to sing to keep their courage, but their voices cracked and faded until only silence remained, and in that silence came the first sighting. A soldier named Beric, tall, brave, known for laughing at fear, stumbled back into camp, pale as ash, his armor streaked with mud, and his eyes wide with something no one could name. He had seen a figure, he said, tall-robed, glowing with faint blue light, hovering over the very altar that had once stood in the chapel ruins. It didn't move, didn't speak, but it looked directly at him, and in its eyes he saw not malice but sorrow, deep ancient sorrow that made him fall to his knees, not from fear, but from guilt. Others scoffed until they too began seeing things. A child standing at the edge of the trees holding a broken candle, nuns in scorched robes walking in silence past the tents. Even horses refused to enter the ruins. No matter how hard they were whipped in the morning, nothing looked different. Yet the men packed quickly, unwilling to stay another moment. The commanders dismissed it all as stress, illusions of tired men, but the stories spread and reached the eastern camp. Days later, the Eastern King's men laughed, called it superstition, until it happened to them, not at the same monastery, but on the field just before battle. They saw something, or rather heard something, a voice whispering, not in anger but in mourning, a weeping that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The wind carried the scent of burning incense, though none had been lit, and shadows moved strangely across the ground as if cast by figures long gone. One archer fell to his knees and cried for forgiveness, though no one knew what he was sorry for. Another threw down his bow and refused to fight, claiming he had heard his mother's voice, though she had been dead for years. This ghost, whoever or whatever it was, did not belong to one side. It haunted both armies, appearing not in rage but in unbearable sadness. It showed them glimpses of what had been lost: families, homes, friends, and futures. In moments of stillness before dawn, soldiers found themselves remembering the faces of those they killed or the children they left behind back home, and slowly the fire in their hearts for war began to die. Commanders grew uneasy, their orders shouted but followed less quickly than before. Desertions increased, not from fear of the enemy, but fear of what lingered in the quiet nights. Even the kings began to feel it. One dreamt of standing in a field of graves, and as he turned over each marker he saw not enemy names but those of his own kin. The other awoke to find his crown cold to the touch and etched with strange symbols that faded by morning. Eventually they agreed to meet, not to sign peace but to negotiate terms. But the meeting took place near the monastery at the request of both parties. Perhaps deep down they hoped to see it together and understand it. But nothing happened that day. No lights, no voices, just wind rustling dry leaves and a single candle left unlit on the broken altar. Yet something changed in them both as they stood in the ruins, surrounded by the weight of silence. They saw for the first time the futility of what they had done. 20 years of fighting for land that neither could truly Hold 20 years of sons buried and names forgotten, and over what pride a border a slight insult. Both men left without speaking, but in the days that followed messengers were sent, lines were drawn, and an agreement was made no more blood would be spilled over Arvenmore. The two armies pulled back, and the valley was declared sacred land, untouched, neutral, belonging to no kingdom, and it was said that from that day no soldier ever dared camp near that monastery again, not for fear of death, but for reverence of what they had seen, or perhaps what had seen them. And in time, the story faded, becoming a tale whispered by firelight, a bedtime warning, a myth to hush quarrelsome children. But the locals remembered, and each year on the night of that last battle they lit a single candle on the old altar in silence, not in fear but in gratitude, because sometimes peace comes not from treaties or triumphs, but from the echo of sorrow too powerful to ignore, and the ghost that ended a war was not one seeking vengeance, but one reminding the living of what it means to be human. When the war ended, there was no grand celebration, no parades, no songs, no shouts of joy, only silence. A long, stretching silence that hung over the valley like morning fog. It was the kind of quiet that made people unsure whether to feel relieved or afraid. For 20 years they had known only the sounds of metal and mourning. Now, the absence of violence felt just as heavy. In the weeks that followed, soldiers returned home like ghosts of themselves. Some arrived in full armor, but with hollow eyes. Others walked barefoot, not because they had no shoes, but because they wanted to feel the ground again. The ground that no longer trembled beneath the weight of war. They did not speak much. What could be said about what they had witnessed? Stories began to drift like smoke through the villages. Stories not of victories or bravery, but of something else. A ghost, they said. A spirit that had no name, but was known by all who saw it. Some described it as a woman cloaked in silver mist. Others swore it was a child with glowing eyes. A few never saw anything at all, but still felt it watching, weeping, warning. No one could agree on its form, but they all agreed on what it did. It stopped the killing. Villagers who lived near the monastery began leaving small offerings, herbs, bread, flowers, not as a tribute to royalty, but in gratitude to whatever had stepped between the blades. One old woman knelt there each morning at sunrise, her hands folded, her eyes closed. She had lost 2 sons in the war, but when asked what she prayed for, she only said, "Peace, and the one who gave it." The land around the ruined monastery changed. Where once only weeds grew, now wildflowers bloomed without planting. Birds sang there again. Even deer wandered close without fear. Travelers noticed that the air near the ruins felt warmer, gentler, like the valley itself had exhaled. Some said they slept better after passing through. A few even claimed they dreamed of the ghost, though none remembered what she said, only how they felt when they woke. The kings of both nations, now older, grayer, met once more, not for battle, not even for politics, but to walk side by side through the valley. They brought no guards, only candles, no crown, only quiet. The people gathered in silence, watching their former enemies step into the ruins with lowered heads. There was no speech, no scrolls signed. Just 2 men and a broken altar between them, and the stillness of old sorrow hanging gently in the air. From that day forward, the valley was declared untouchable by law. No one would farm it. No one would build on it. It belonged to no kingdom, no crown. It was simply known as the Field of Remembrance. And every year, on the same night the ghost had first appeared, villagers and soldiers alike came to place candles on the stones. Some wept, some simply sat in silence. Others brought children to teach them about a war that ended not in fire, but in a whisper. One of those children grew into a poet. He spent 3 nights in the valley alone, listening. And when he returned, he wrote a single line that would later be carved into the monastery wall. She did not come to haunt, but to remind. That line echoed through generations like a soft bell. And though no one ever saw the ghost again, they all felt her, in the wind, in the stars, in the silence that followed every storm. Some tried to explain it away. They said the ghost was a legend born of trauma, a trick of the mind, a story invented by tired men desperate for hope. But those who had stood in that valley knew otherwise. You could not see her with eyes, they said. You saw her in memory, in regret, in the aching truth that peace had always been possible if only they had listened sooner. The ghost became a symbol, not of fear, but of mercy, a reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion can break through. That sometimes it takes something beyond this world to make us see what truly matters in it. Soldiers began laying down swords to become builders, fathers, teachers. Young men learned not just how to fight, but how to forgive. And every village that once feared its neighbor began hosting shared feasts. Honoring the night everything changed. Even animals seemed to sense the shift. Dogs barked less in the night. Horses refused to tread too close to the ruins. And cats were often found sitting quietly by the old stone wall, their eyes wide, watching something no human could see. A scholar who studied war for 40 years visited the site late in life. He walked slowly, leaning on a carved wooden cane. He did not speak for hours. Then finally he said, "I have read thousands of battle records, but this place tells a story no scroll ever could." He left without taking a single note, only tears on his cheeks. On the 100th anniversary of the ghost's appearance, a great circle of candles was lit around the monastery ruins. Thousands gathered. No one gave a speech. No one played music. Just the wind. Just the light. And just the memory of a time when grief had spoken louder than swords. People no longer feared war because of its violence. They feared it because they had learned its cost. The true cost. Not in gold. Not in territory. But in time. In love. In silence. In the faces they would never see again. And though the ghost never returned, no one needed her to. She had done what no king, no army, no prophecy could. She reminded humanity that peace is not weakness, that surrender is not always loss, that even the deepest scars can become symbols of something greater. She came in sorrow, she left in silence, and she was never forgotten.